The VREX Council convened in their orbital platform's primary observation chamber, a space so meticulously climate-controlled that the temperature varied by no more than 0.3 degrees across its entire volume. They were reviewing Survey Report 7449, and the conclusion was, as far as the VREX were concerned, irrefutable. The planet below, currently designated as Candidate 7449 in their catalogue, because the VREX believed in efficiency over poetry, possessed an equatorial jungle belt approximately 8,000 kilometers wide that was, according to every metric they considered relevant, aggressively uninhabitable. Senior Assessor Thexic highlighted the relevant data with one of their secondary manipulation appendages. The jungle canopy was so dense that orbital imaging couldn't penetrate past the upper leaf layer. Humidity levels averaged 97%, with occasional brief respites down to 94% during what passed for the dry season. The atmosphere was breathable, technically, but breathing it was roughly equivalent to inhaling hot vegetable soup. Metal corrosion rates were catastrophic. Their survey probe, constructed from materials that had survived 3 centuries of deep space exposure, had lasted approximately 7 hours on the surface before something in the soil decided to dissolve its outer casing. The biological activity readings were so high that the instruments had initially flagged them as sensor malfunctions, categorically uninhabitable for sentient colonization, the Thexic announced, and the Council murmured their agreement with the particular satisfaction of beings who had never been wrong about anything important. They noted this conclusion in their official reports with appropriate citations and cross-references. The planet would remain in their database as a curiosity, perhaps worth studying from orbit in another century or two, but certainly not worth the expense and danger of a surface colony. Then their long-range sensors detected the human survey ship entering the system. The VREX did what any reasonable species would do when observing another sentient species approaching a death trap. They transmitted a polite but firm warning. They included their complete data package, their analysis, their conclusions, and a sincere recommendation that the humans select literally any other planet in the sector. The human response arrived within the hour. "Thank you for the information. Very thoughtful." Proceeding with survey mission as planned, the VREX updated their files to include an estimated date for when they would need to coordinate a remains retrieval operation. They gave the humans 3 weeks, which they privately considered generous. The human landing party touched down in one of the few clearings large enough to accommodate their shuttle, a gap in the canopy that Dalmar Chen, the expedition's xenobotanist, immediately identified as temporary. "This'll be gone in a month," he announced cheerfully, examining the encroaching vegetation with the expression of someone who had just discovered a new and terrible hobby. "Maybe less. These edge species grow about 8 centimeters a day when they smell open space." Sasha Okoye, expedition leader and possessor of the unsettling habit of smiling at problems, nodded while reviewing the preliminary environmental readings on her handheld. "Then we'll need to establish our actual base camp somewhere more defensible." Kirabo thoughts. Kirabo, whose military record was distinguished primarily by creative interpretations of regulations and an alarming success rate, surveyed the perimeter with the expression of someone conducting a threat assessment. Defensible might be the wrong word. This jungle isn't attacking, it's just existing very aggressively in all directions at once. We're not going to hold ground here, we're going to negotiate for it. The jungle made its position clear immediately. The insects arrived first, things the size of human thumbs with too many legs, and what appeared to be active curiosity about the new arrivals. The humidity transformed the air into something that had to be consumed rather than breathed. The temperature held steady at 36 degrees, and the environmental suits that the team had optimistically packed proved useless within an hour, condensation forming inside the helmets faster than the recyclers could compensate. They abandoned the suits and accepted that they would simply be wet for the foreseeable future. Dalmar established his portable lab with the efficiency of someone who had done this on 17 previous planets, though he admitted that none of those 17 had been quite this enthusiastic about reclaiming space. "I count at least 4 species within visual range that are probably venomous, possibly carnivorous, and definitely interested in us," he reported, carefully collecting samples with hands that never quite stopped moving. "The good news is that the local biochemistry is different enough that we're probably not food. The bad news is that we might be interesting, which could be worse." What followed was not the dramatic struggle that the Vrex monitoring team anticipated. There was no heroic battle against nature, no desperate survival scenario, no climactic moment where human ingenuity triumphed over environmental hostility. Instead, something happened that the Vrex found far more disturbing. The humans started taking notes, detailed notes, obsessive notes. Notes about rainfall patterns and soil composition and insect behavior and plant growth rates. Sasha instituted a documentation protocol that required every team member to log observations every 4 hours. They measured everything. When a tree root punctured their equipment shelter on the 3rd night, growing through the floor with what seemed like deliberate intent, they didn't curse the planet or question their life choices. They carefully documented what type of root it was, how fast it had grown, what direction it had come from, and whether it showed preferential growth patterns. Then they moved the shelter and adjusted their placement protocols. The Vrex increased their monitoring frequency. This behavior did not match their models for how sentient species responded to hostile environments. 3 weeks passed, and the human camp had somehow not been consumed. The Vrex began reviewing their environmental assessments, looking for errors in their data. They found none. The jungle was exactly as hostile as they had calculated. The humans were simply responding to that hostility in ways that made no sense. Sasha stood in what had become the main camp clearing, a space they maintained through twice daily perimeter checks, and addressed her team. "We're establishing routine," she announced, and the team nodded because this was apparently something humans did. They created routine in places where routine should be impossible. Work periods were shortened to 4 hours because the humidity made longer shifts dangerous. Rest periods were mandatory and enforced because exhaustion killed faster than any predator. Everyone learned everyone else's job because the jungle didn't care about specialization when it decided to demonstrate its creativity. Dalmar made a discovery during the 2nd month that changed their entire approach. He'd been mapping the growth patterns of the dominant canopy species, cross-referencing them with local weather data and lunar cycles, when he noticed something that shouldn't exist in chaos rhythm. The jungle, for all its apparent randomness, operated on predictable patterns. Certain plants grew aggressively during specific lunar phases. Insect activity peaked and ebbed on reliable schedules. Afternoon rains arrived with clock-like precision. The flooding patterns in the low-lying areas followed routes that could be mapped and anticipated. "It's not chaos," Dalmar explained to a gathering that included the entire camp, because Sasha had instituted a policy of shared information. "It's complexity. There's a difference. Chaos is unpredictable. This is just really, really complicated. But complicated can be learned." They began mapping the rhythms. They identified the hours when insects were least active and scheduled outside work accordingly. They traced the flooding patterns and established paths on higher ground that stayed passable even during the daily deluge. They learned which trees had shallow root systems that could be built around and which had deep anchors that made them landmarks. They stopped fighting the jungle's patterns and started working within them. Kirabo, without asking permission from anyone in particular, began conducting what he called environmental literacy training. He taught the scientists to read weather patterns in canopy movement, to identify safe water sources by observing local fauna, to navigate by recognizing distinctive root formations and bark patterns. The team learned to move through the jungle, not by forcing paths, but by finding the routes that the jungle was willing to accommodate. The VREX monitoring team updated their reports with increasing frequency. Their language shifted from certainty to confusion. They calculated survival probabilities and recalculated them when humans exceeded those probabilities. They predicted evacuation dates and revised those predictions when evacuations didn't occur. In their private communications, some VREX began suggesting that their models might need adjustment. This was the VREX equivalent of existential crisis. Month 2 brought a development that the VREX categorized as anomalous human behavior, subsection inexplicable persistence. The humans started building permanent structures, not prefabricated units dropped from orbit, but actual construction using materials harvested from the local environment. Dalmar had spent weeks testing various tree species, and he'd identified several with wood dense enough to resist the jungle's enthusiasm for decomposition. The key word was resist, not prevent. The wood would eventually rot, but eventually could be measured in years rather than weeks, which counted as success. They harvested fallen timber because the jungle provided no shortage of that. The canopy above was in constant flux, with massive branches falling regularly as the competition for sunlight played out in slow motion. They treated the wood with compounds derived from local plant resins that Dalmar's experiments suggested had preservative qualities. The results were imperfect but functional, which seemed to be humanity's standard for acceptable. The structures they built were elevated platforms, raised on posts driven deep into the few stable ground patches they could identify. They didn't try to dominate the landscape. They worked with it, placing buildings where the jungle showed natural clearings, where root systems indicated stable soil, where water flow patterns suggested the ground wouldn't turn into swamp during the rainy season. Every placement was a negotiation with the environment. Sasha organized work crews that approached path maintenance as a daily ritual. They cleared roots not through wholesale destruction, but through selective pruning, and they learned through painful trial and frequent error that the jungle would reclaim any completely cleared area within 48 hours. The solution was counterintuitive. They stopped completely clearing. Instead, they edited. They removed enough growth to make passage possible while leaving the underlying structure intact. They created paths that followed the jungle's existing logic rather than imposing geometric efficiency. The approach worked, more or less. The paths required daily maintenance, but they persisted. The jungle tested them constantly, sending exploratory vines across the roots, dropping seeds that sprouted with alarming speed, but it didn't reclaim them entirely. It was as if the jungle had decided that this level of human presence fell within acceptable parameters. More humans arrived. Then more. The settlement expanded to 3 satellite stations connected by paths that somehow remained passable despite the jungle's best efforts. The population reached 40 individuals. The VREX began holding private discussions about whether their fundamental models of habitability needed revision, which was roughly equivalent to humans questioning whether gravity might be negotiable. 6 months after landing, the VREX monitoring team transmitted a request for detailed reports because they had stopped understanding what they were observing. The human settlement had become something their language lacked terminology for, not a colony in the traditional sense of imposed order, but an organism that had achieved something like symbiosis with an environment designed to be hostile to foreign life. The humans had established routines that bordered on ritual. Morning surveys identified overnight growth that needed managing. Afternoon sessions focused on maintenance of existing structures, replacing sections where the jungle had won minor victories, reinforcing areas where defenses were weakening. Evenings were reserved for documentation, every team member contributing observations to a growing database that tracked everything from insect migration patterns to the most effective placement angles for support posts. They had learned through experience that left scars both literal and figurative, which insects were merely annoying and which required immediate attention. They had catalogued which plants would tolerate proximity to human structures and which needed to be removed immediately before they demonstrated why. The settlement included cultivated areas now, where Dalmar had successfully encouraged fast-growing edible species from off-world, not replacing native plants but fitting into gaps in the jungle's ecology, occupying niches that the local flora hadn't claimed. Water collection systems worked with the daily rains rather than against them, huge leaf-shaped collectors that mimicked the canopy's own strategies. Waste processing fed back into the soil in ways that local decomposers found acceptable, maybe even attractive. The settlement had achieved a sort of ecological integration that wasn't exactly harmony but wasn't open warfare either. New arrivals no longer gasped at the humidity after the first week. They accepted it as baseline reality, the way humans accepted gravity or the passage of time. Children, because of course humans had brought children, because humans brought children everywhere, regardless of whether that made sense, played in supervised clearings, learning to identify safe plants before they learned to read, learning to recognize weather patterns before they learned arithmetic. This was normal to them. They had no context for environments that didn't require constant negotiation. The settlement had a name now: Clearwater. Kirabo had proposed it with perfect deadpan delivery, and the name had stuck, despite the fact that no water within 500 kilometers could accurately be described as clear. The irony was apparently part of the appeal. The Vrex conducted what they classified as their final comprehensive assessment. Their conclusion, translated from formal Vrex analytical language, amounted to philosophical disturbance. The humans had not conquered the jungle. They had not tamed it. They had not even particularly impressed it. They had simply achieved something the Vrex found conceptually troubling. They had convinced the jungle to tolerate their presence through nothing more sophisticated than patient, relentless, annoying persistence. The settlement wasn't a victory over nature. It was a negotiated truce. And the humans seemed perfectly content with that arrangement. One standard year after landing, Sasha stood at the edge of what had become the village center, a large clearing maintained through daily effort that would vanish within a week if they stopped maintaining it, and reviewed progress reports on her personal display. Clearwater housed 73 permanent residents now. 5 satellite research stations operated at various distances from the main settlement, connected by paths that required constant maintenance but remained consistently passable. 12 kilometers of maintained routes wound through the jungle, following topography and growth patterns rather than geometric logic. The agricultural teams had successfully grown 3 off-world crops to harvest, supplementing supplies from orbit with locally produced food. The jungle had destroyed 2 storage facilities, teaching expensive lessons about foundation requirements. It had reclaimed 4 temporary structures that the humans had decided weren't worth defending, a tactical retreat that acknowledged the limits of human stubbornness. It had introduced 11 new species of aggressive flora that had required creative management solutions, some of which had worked. The settlement's success rate, measured against initial projections, was deeply improbable. Sasha noted this with satisfaction. Improbable was better than impossible, and impossible had never stopped humans from trying. The Vrex requested a formal meeting, which surprised nobody on Sasha's team. The Vrex delegation attended remotely because they weren't setting foot in that humidity, and Sasha couldn't blame them. The lead Vrex assessor, Sexic, who had written the original survey report declaring the planet uninhabitable, began with what seemed like genuine curiosity. "We have observed your settlement's development with great interest," Sexic said through the translation matrix. "Our models predicted failure. You have not failed. We have reviewed our data extensively and found no errors in our assessment of environmental hostility. This leads to a question we find troubling. How did your species know you could survive here when all available data suggested you could not?" Sasha watched through the observation window as a work crew repaired a walkway that something had chewed through during the night. The crew worked with casual efficiency, replacing damaged sections with practiced ease. This was just another morning in clear water. She considered how to answer the question. She could explain human history, could detail the fact that her species had spent millennia convincing various hostile environments to barely tolerate human presence. She could discuss evolutionary stubbornness, the particular trait that made humans treat "this will kill you" as a starting negotiation position rather than a final conclusion. She could cite examples of humans establishing settlements in deserts, on ice sheets, in volcanic regions, on worlds with thin atmospheres and crushing gravity and radiation levels that should have sterilized anything with DNA. Instead, she told them the simpler truth, the one that was somehow more disturbing. "We didn't know," she said. "We just decided that 'this will kill you' was less compelling than 'but what if we tried anyway?'" The Vrex were silent for a long moment. Then Sexic spoke again. "This approach seems inefficient, also dangerous, also statistically inadvisable." "Probably," Sasha agreed. "But it's produced results you didn't predict, which suggests efficiency might not be the only valid metric." "We do not understand," Sexic admitted, and Sasha suspected they never would. Understanding required accepting that sometimes the correct response to overwhelming evidence was to ignore it and proceed anyway. The Vrex were not wired for that kind of thinking. "Thank you for your concern," Sasha said politely. "And for the warning you sent when we first arrived. It was accurate and well-intentioned. We appreciate it." She ended the connection and returned to the day's work schedule. There were paths to maintain, structures to repair, growth patterns to document, and approximately 73 humans who needed to coordinate their ongoing negotiation with a jungle that would happily reclaim everything if they stopped paying attention. Morning mist rose through the canopy, filtering the early light into something green and diffuse. Work crews gathered for their briefings, checking equipment and reviewing the day's priorities. Dalmar taught a class on plant identification to newly arrived colonists, emphasizing that respect for the environment wasn't philosophical but practical necessity. Learn the plants, learn their patterns, learn which ones would tolerate you and which ones required distance. Survival wasn't about conquest, it was about achieving sufficient understanding to coexist. Kirabo reviewed security protocols with the perimeter team, protocols that had nothing to do with combat and everything to do with reading weather patterns, predicting ecological shifts, and recognizing when the jungle was about to demonstrate something new and educational. Security in Clearwater meant staying alert, staying flexible, and staying humble about humanity's place in an ecosystem that predated them by millions of years. In the education structure, built around a tree too large to move, incorporating it into the design, because removing it would have destabilized the entire area. Children attended morning lessons. They learned to write their names while vines tapped experimentally at the windows. They learned basic mathematics while insects the size of their fists investigated the screens. This was normal to them. They had no context for buildings that didn't require daily maintenance, for environments that didn't demand constant attention, for spaces that didn't need to be negotiated. Sasha updated the settlement logs, noting that Clearwater had achieved something remarkable, not through superiority, but through the very human talent for being too stubborn to accept the obvious. The Vex had said the jungle would stop everyone, and they weren't wrong exactly. It had stopped species that expected environments to accommodate them, species that demanded submission from their surroundings, species that measured success in terms of conquest and control. The humans had succeeded by doing something the Vex found incomprehensible. They had accommodated the environment right back. They had observed, adapted, learned and persisted with the kind of annoying determination that eventually wore down even the most hostile wilderness. They had established a presence, not through force but through patience, not through dominance but through the simple refusal to leave. The jungle still tried to reclaim everything, every single day. The humans still prevented it, every single day. And this arrangement, maintained through constant mutual effort, had achieved a sort of equilibrium that might, with decades of continued attention, be mistaken for peace. Another work crew headed out to maintain the eastern path, carrying cutting tools and marker stakes, and the resigned expressions of people engaged in a task that would need to be repeated tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that forever. Sasha watched them go and considered what they'd built here. This was what humans did. They found places that didn't want them, and stayed anyway, not through conquest but through the simple refusal to accept no as a permanent answer. They negotiated, adapted, learned and persisted. They turned uninhabitable into challenging, and challenging into daily routine. They made homes in places that tried very hard to kill them, and they did it with patience and stubbornness, and the kind of long-term thinking that treated decades as reasonable time frames. The jungle would never welcome them. That was fine. Welcome wasn't necessary. The jungle was learning to expect them, learning that humans would maintain their paths, and repair their structures, and persist in their annoying presence, no matter what the environment threw at them. And expectation, in the end, amounted to the same thing as tolerance, which was all humans had ever really needed from any environment they'd decided to inhabit. Sasha returned to her office. A structure that would require repairs next month, had required repairs last month, and would continue requiring repairs for as long as it stood, and began reviewing the next supply request. Clearwater was growing. More humans were coming. The jungle would continue being a jungle. And somewhere overhead, the Vex were probably revising their models, trying to understand how humans had made clear paths and villages from trees in a place that should have stopped them. The answer was simpler than they thought, though perhaps no less strange. Humans had simply decided that being stopped wasn't interesting, and had proceeded accordingly.